Today in documentary studies, we turn to ethical questions in documentary studies and try to provide a guide for philosophical decision-making. We begin by reviewing the origin and development of ethical codes in the 20th century, and I'll try to provide to you some notes toward philosophical decision-making in philosophy based on three theories: utilitarianism, Kantianism, and social justice theory. I'll talk to you about the meaning of the philosophical impulse and try to end with some practical advice on methods of critical thought and how these methods are related to philosophical decision-making. Robert Coles, in doing documentary work, sets forth a number of the tensions that researchers doing documentary work feel. The demands of reality, for example, against those of art. The demands of finding out and trying to describe what it is that you've found in realistic and factual terms, and finding that a tension arises between trying to express what you find in terms of reality and objectivity and then trying to render it aesthetically pleasing at the same time. The temptation of photography, writing, transcription analysis, and film is strong, especially when we try to find ways to make our work aesthetically pleasing as well. So those ideas of tension and all these elements described on these slides are important, and we have to try to find ways to understand these tensions fully, and if possible, to try to find methods that help us resolve them. Where do ethical codes come from in the 20th century, and what can the result of some of these codes tell us about the way we should conduct our own research? You'll say, when we begin, that talking about the Nazi medical experiments will have nothing to do with what you're doing, but as we go through this lecture, I hope to show that all things are connected in terms of research, and that research that involves human subjects is, period, something that involves potential violations of the autonomy of others. And by this, we have to understand these four studies I'm going to now describe as being connected and not unrelated to your own work. To begin, the Nazi medical experiments were conducted from 1933 to 1945. They were conducted, of course, as you know, by the Third Reich in Europe. The programs of the Nazi regime included sterilization, euthanasia, numerous medical experiments to produce a population of racially pure Germans, or Aryans, who were designed to rule the world. Now, in order to try to find out ways to promote Aryanism more fully, German doctors, rather Nazi doctors more properly, undertook a number of medical experiments that were conducted on prisoners of war. These prisoners of war were considered racially valueless persons, people who had been confined to concentration camps previously. The Nazi medical experiments are numerous. Perhaps some of the best known are those of the hypothermia studies, in which subjects were immersed in bath temperatures ranging from 2 to 12 degrees centigrade. Researchers noted that immersion in water of 5 degrees centigrade is tolerated by clothed men for 40 to 60 minutes, whereas raising the water temperature to 15 degrees centigrade increases the period of tolerance to 4 to 5 hours, after which people, of course, by virtue of this immersion, actually died. The Nazi medical experiments violated, obviously, numerous rights of human research subjects, and the selection of those subjects was racially biased, demonstrating an unfair, cruel selection process. The subjects also, of course, had no opportunity to refuse participation. They were prisoners who were coerced and who were forced to participate. Those involved in the Nazi experiments were brought to trial before the Nuremberg trial, and this treatment of human subjects in these studies led to the development of the Nuremberg Code in 1949, and this ethical code of conduct contains rules, some general, other specific, that were an early example of ways to get researchers to conduct investigations that were ethically responsible. The Tuskegee study, the second study that I'd like to review for you here, began in 1932 by not someone abroad, not a group abroad, but in this case the United States Public Health Service. In this study, the United States Public Health Service began an investigation of the path of syphilis in black men in the small rural town of Tuskegee, Alabama. The study continued for 40 years. It was conducted to determine the natural course of syphilis in adult black man. The research subjects were black men who were organized into two groups. One group included 400 men who had untreated syphilis. The second group included 200 men without syphilis who served as a control group. Many of the subjects who consented to participate in the study were not informed about the purpose and procedures of the research, and some individuals are unaware that there were subjects in the study. By 1936, it was apparent that men with syphilis developed more complications in the control group. 10 years later, the death rate of those with syphilis was twice as high as it had been for the control group. Published reports started appearing in 1936, and additional papers were published every 4 to 6 years. In 1969, the Center for Disease Control decided that the study would continue, and the study continued on into the 70s when it was finally stopped after journalists in the Washington Star sparked outrage about it. And at that point, in 1972, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare finally stopped a study that had been allowed to continue for 40 years. The Willowbrook study was conducted from the mid-1950s to the early 1970s, in which Dr. Saul Krugman conducted research on hepatitis at Willowbrook, an institution for the mentally retarded. These particular subjects were children who were deliberately infected with the hepatitis virus. Early subjects were fed extracts of stool from infected individuals. Later subjects received injections of more purified form of the virus. During the 20-year study, Willowbrook closed its doors to new inmates because of overcrowded conditions, but the research ward, where these people were being infected with hepatitis, continued to admit new inmates. Parents were forced to get permission from the child to be in the study in order to gain their child's admission to the institution. And Krugman and his research team participated in the study and published research from the 50s to the 70s. The study continued, indeed, into the early 1970s. The Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital study was another highly publicized example of unethical research. It was a study conducted at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in the 1960s. The purpose of this study was to determine patients' response to live cancer cells. 22 patients were injected with a suspension containing liver cells that had been generated from human cancer tissue. The rights of the patients weren't protected because they weren't informed that they were taking part of the research, and they were not told that the injections they received were live cancer cells. This research, if it might be called research at all as opposed to just period unethical conduct, resulted in the Belmont Report. The Belmont Report was developed in 1974 by a national committee that was given the task of formulating guidelines that would protect the rights and welfare of participants in biomedical and behavioral research. Prior to this work, there had been safeguards to protect subjects, but serious violations had occurred nonetheless. The Belmont Report, which can be found in a number of different places, either in print or online, provides a number of general guidelines. Let's turn to some of those guidelines. The Belmont Report, as well as many professional codes, provide a series of, we'll begin with this, very precise responses to how research should be conducted. Autonomy is a chief word in all of these reports, all of these codes, including the code of the American Psychological Association, which we'll turn to in a minute. Autonomy is a very important principle, of course, meaning independence, and in the context of research ethics, it refers to a participant's right as well as the ability to choose whether to take part into a study or to continue in the study. Most research, field research, is reviewed by an institutional review board, an IRB, which performs oversight mechanism by performing a risk-benefit analysis, both in terms of the impact of the research on the participants and the usefulness of the research design. Documentation of informed consent is very frequently required, and as well, as you'll see, there is a criteria for institutional review board membership here as well. Various researchers, members of the communities, as well as members of the clergy are part of IRB review. There are procedures for expedited review, those pieces of research that can be evaluated without undue delay. Also, some research is exempt review, and some research requiring full board review as well. There are traditionally, in any IRB, precise questions that research committees will ask about the research being undertaken. These will have to do with the role of the investigator, the nature of the study, the research participants, the material or the way that the research will be conducted, ways to ensure an individual's confidentiality, and ways that a participant might be debriefed. The American Psychological Association has developed ethical principles for psychologists and code of conduct. And while we're not psychologists in this course of documentary studies, I think that we can infer quite a bit from the APA's standards. Let's review these in terms of their order, beginning with the idea of competence. As a researcher, you should understand fully the boundaries of your particular competence and the limits of your expertise. You're also bound, I think, to maintain knowledge of the constructs that you're trying to develop in your study. We've talked about the importance of performing a thorough literature review before. And also, as you go through the study, recognizing the need to further increase your knowledge, both by what you're finding out empirically and by additional information that might be made possible by a more extensive literature review. The second principle, integrity, asks you as a researcher to be honest, to be fair, to be respectful of others, and to also be aware of your own belief systems, your own values, your own needs, your own limitations, especially time limitations, and the effect that those will have on the work you're trying to do. The third principle asks us to be aware of our professional and our scientific responsibilities. And here, you should keep in mind the necessity for collaborating with others, not only those who are fellow researchers with you in the class, but collaborating with other professionals, other researchers who are a bit further along in this journey than you are. Respect for other people's rights and dignity has to do, again, with that very important principle of autonomy. The idea of independence, the idea that a participant has the right to refuse to take part in a study or not to take part in a study. A concern for others' welfare has to do with the principle of beneficence, the doing of good, and to avoid non-malfeasance, which asks us not to do harm, to have concern for others' welfare, and to understand fully the difference, for example, in power between yourselves and others. Finally, the APA asks us generally to attend to the social responsibility that we have, an awareness, as it were, of our call of service, our call to be in service to others. And here I'd like you to recall, perhaps find, another book by Robert Coles called A Call of Service, A Witness to Idealism, published in 1993. This book will provide a more full idea of what is meant by the call of service and professional responsibility to others. Many times, though, codes only talk to us about safety and risk. And though I've been interpreting these codes very broadly, perhaps even philosophically, in some way, many codes only deal with ways to protect the individual researcher, protect the rights of others. But the codes don't compel us to ask more deep, more profound questions that go beyond the idea of safety and risk. So at this point of the lecture, I want to go beyond what we might call level 1 and move on to level 2, and ask us to think more deeply about ethical considerations, not only for the health professions, as I've put here, because we still might get the idea that we're talking in terms of human health, but ethical considerations for the health professions and ethical considerations beyond the health professions, in this case, ethical considerations in documentary studies. We begin then with the question of what is philosophy. This is an attempt to understand basic truths and principles that underlie all branches of knowledge, all forms of reality. Well, that's certainly a big order, isn't it? Let's try to break this down into more precise subjects of philosophy. My colleague Eric Katz in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at NJIT breaks philosophy down into 5 subjects, and a lot of his thought as a philosopher and also as a documentarist, he's done extensive work on the Holocaust, will lead us through this complex conversation about philosophy into some precise guidelines at the end. The first field of philosophy is logic, the basic methods of thought itself. What are accepted rules of thought? How can an idea be proven true? The second is epistemology, a word that we'll use frequently in this course, the study of knowledge itself, but we frequently ask ourselves, how do we know? How do we know if what we found has been true? And what is the basis of knowledge itself? Metaphysics is the study of the ultimate nature of the reality of the universe. What is reality in general? Do spiritual beings exist? And I'm quite interested in the idea of metaphysics. Certainly, Studs Terkel, in his book, Will the Circle Be Unbroken?, asked people to think deeply and to chat with him about experiences that bring about an idea of spirituality. And I wouldn't want to think of documentary studies as not dealing with metaphysics, or metaphysics having something to deal with a group of subjects that are too philosophical and beyond the power of the investigation of the documentarist. That's not true at all. Aesthetics is a study of the nature of beauty. Can beauty be defined, and is there an objective standard for beauty? And 2, I think the role of aesthetics is an important part of what we might investigate as documentarists, and also, as I said earlier, achieve tension in the work we do. How do we balance the aesthetic nature of what it is we're trying to represent with the truthfulness of what it is we're trying to represent? And here, of course, what we're talking about now, ethics, the nature of the good, the proper, and the virtuous. How do we know what is right? And the principles of ethical behavior be discovered, defined, and justified. Before going on, I need to reveal my own bias here. I don't believe in ethical relativism. I do believe that principles are universal, and that principles, even in societies and cultures vastly different from our own, can be defined and understood if we look at them deeply to have a rational basis. And so it is that I want to look at a definition of morality and a definition of ethics, and for my own part bypass the idea of relativism. Over the years, I've used James Rachel's The Elements of Moral Philosophy with many of my students. It's a thin book, and it's quite excellent in providing an overview of what might be called obligation theory, or our obligation to do right by ourselves, our obligation to do right by others. Rachel provides a definition of morality that will at least give us something to work with here early on in this discussion. Rachel tells us that morality is, at the very least, the effort to guide one's conduct by reason. Now, by reason, Rachel says, that is to do what there are the best reasons for doing, while giving equal weight to the interest of each individual who will be affected, that is, impacted by one's conduct. And as I hope to show you in a minute, the Kantian element in Rachel's definition is very strong. Let's move now to the 3 philosophical systems I told you about earlier. The first is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is perhaps more than a philosophy. It's also in many ways a social movement. Hume, Bentham, John Stuart Mill were all considered utilitarians. Mill proposed the essence of utilitarianism in his Greatest Happiness Principle. Mill wrote that the ultimate end, with reference to and for the sake of which all other things are desired, whether we're considering our own good or that of other people, is an existence exempt as far as possible from pain and as rich as possible in enjoyments. Well, think about that. It certainly seems to make sense, at least in one way, that we seek pleasure and we try to avoid pain. But looking at it a little bit more deeply, we see that some elements in this prove problematic. Friedrich Nietzsche, in Twilight of the Idols in 1889, said of utilitarianism that man does not strive after happiness, only the Englishman does that. Truth is there. We work on many principles, and not just the least of which is to increase our own happiness. Many things we do not do for the sake of pleasure. We do for responsibility, for right, for the idea of duty. The second thing you'll notice in utilitarianism is a complete absence of any idea of a divinity or a collective whole manifested in a divinity that allows us to look at more general principles. The word God does not appear, for example, in this sort of statement. So utilitarianism, I think, gets us to think about group consciousness and what's helpful for a group. But in its emphasis on the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, I think that, at least I find, utilitarianism is narrow. So I'll ask us to go beyond utilitarianism and over to an earlier theory by Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant proposes for us the idea of a categorical imperative. In perhaps one of the most important books in Western civilization, Grounding for a Metaphysics of Morals, published in 1785, Kant writes the following brief statement: "Act only according to that maxim, by which you can at the same time will that that maxim be thought of as a universal law." Well, in some ways, it's an important principle because it asks us to operationalize the particular action we have and to bring it forward into a general principle. Kant was very interested in the idea of these sort of hypothetical imperatives and very interested in the idea of our absolute rule and our duty not to lie. Imagine, for example, that someone is fleeing from a murderer and tells you he's going home to hide. Then the murderer comes along and asks where the first man went. You believe that if you tell the truth, the murderer will find the victim and kill him. What should you do? Should you tell the truth or should you lie? Well, Kant says, 1, you should do only those actions that conform to rules that you could will to be adopted universally. That's what the categorical imperative says. 2, if you lie, you would be following the rule, it is permissible to lie. And 3, this rule could not be adopted universally because it would be self-defeating. People would stop believing one another. And 4, therefore, you should not lie. Now, this is a very tough proposition, clearly, because it means that you would have turned an innocent person over to a murderer. But imagine a little more deeply, if you would, that in this particular case, you'd have said that you'd have lied, said the individual was not there. The innocent person has decided to climb out the window to go out into the street. The murderer goes out into the street believing that the innocent victim isn't there in the first place. The murderer finds the innocent person on the street and kills him, and you would have had a hand in that because you would not have told the truth. This is a very difficult principle, and James Rachels goes a little bit further and provides this kind of circumstance beyond the inquiring murderer. He reminds us that Rachels reminds us that during the Second World War, Dutch fishermen regularly smuggled Jewish refugees to England in their boats, and that this would sometime happen. A Dutch boat with refugees in the hold would be stopped by a Nazi patrol boat. The Nazi captain would call out and ask the Dutch captain where he was bound, who was on board, so forth. The fisherman would lie and be allowed to pass. But imagine that the Dutch captain followed Kant's categorical imperative and said that there were Jewish refugees in the hole, opened up the hole, and perhaps became responsible for those people being captured again, or even worse, those people being killed. Further, though, it might also be possible, I would think that at that point the Nazi patrol boat captain might have experienced a kind of epiphany, might have realized that he was doing wrong and stopped pursuing innocence. By lying, the Dutch fisherman might have interrupted that period of epiphany for that patrol boat captain, and indeed might have been responsible for more deaths that the Nazi commander might have had a hand in later. Well, these are very, very tough principles and very tough kinds of things to follow, because they promote in some way rules that are absolute and across time and circumstance, and perhaps in some ways beyond an individual's ability to follow. That the moral judgment has to be backed by good reason, and it certainly has implications for the willingness and ability of the individual to follow reason, but perhaps in some way it asks too much. It asks more than we can do, and perhaps pits us with one moral imperative against the other. In the case I just cited of the fisherman, the idea on one hand of following a truthful version of what happens, to tell the truth, and on the other hand, following an imperative that says do not put others at risk, do not murder. Nevertheless, I think both utilitarianism and Kantianism are helpful. I know I find faults in both of them, or find them troublesome. I think that, as I said in an earlier lecture, I'm not interested in what doesn't count. I'm more interested in some cases in what counts. I'm more interested in trying to find unity and take help wherever I can find it, especially in the kind of difficult work that we're doing when we're doing field research of that particular kind that we're terming at this point documentary studies. Rawls, I think, is a third very helpful theorist. In his theory of justice, Rawls points out two principles. Let's take the second one first, the idea of Pareto optimality. Usually, this is considered an economics principle, and it simply means a configuration is efficient, an idea, a system is efficient, whenever it is possible to change it so as to make some person, at least one, better off without, at the same time, making other persons, at least one, worse off. And in this condition, we might have a kind of optimality. And Rawls says that if we can, we should strive, at least in an ideal, to achieve the idea of Pareto optimality. Rawls also calls us for the idea of justice, and this is why in an earlier lecture I cited Rawls as an ultimate political scientist beyond or including philosophy, and that he says the first virtue of social institutions is to have the idea of justice in society. Rawls has a great debt to Rousseau and the social contract. Let me remind you what the social contract is by reading you a passage from Rousseau's 1762 work. Rousseau writes, "The passage from the state of nature to the civil state produces a very remarkable change in man. Then only, when the voice of duty takes the place of physical impulses and right to appetite, does man, who so far had considered only himself, find that he is forced to act on different principles and to consult his reasoning before listening to his inclinations. His faculties are so stimulated and developed, his ideas so extended, his feelings so ennobled, and his whole soul so uplifted that, did not the abuses of this new condition often degrade him below that which he left, he would be bound to bless continuously the happy moment which took him from it forever, and instead of a stupid and unimaginative animal, made him an intelligent being and a man." The individual in society is celebrated by Rousseau as something that ennobles individuals. We give up certain rights in order to belong to a society. Well, Rawls plays on that, and indeed plays on that a bit more than does either Mill or Kant, by telling us that we might be able to think in terms of philosophical decision-making in a more social way. He proposes many principles in a theory of justice, but two that are relevant to us. The first, Rawls tells us, is that we might imagine an original position And in this, the principles of a just society will be those principles chosen by individuals meeting together at the start of an association. And that in this original position, we might also imagine a veil of ignorance might, as it were, descend on us, that no one person knows about a particular place in society. So, for example, in this case, Rawls asks us to, as it were, put on the shoes of another, and to make our decisions not in terms of decisions that will result in furthering our own interests, but furthering a more common interest of the group. Well, utilitarianism, Kantianism, and social justice theory are three formal systems of ethical decision-making. And if we combine that in some way with the principles and codes set forth by professional organizations such as the American Psychological Association, we can begin to get a general picture of what it means to operate rationally. And let me turn to Rawls again and look for a definition of something I'd like you to think about yourself being in this course and beyond this course as a conscious moral agent. Rawls says this is one who is concerned with the interest of everyone affected, impacted by what you do, who carefully sifts facts and examines their implications, who accepts principles of conduct after scrutinizing them to make sure they're sound, who is willing to listen to reason, even if it means that your earlier convictions have to be revised, how painful that is, and who finally is willing to act, not just to listen, not just to inquire, not just to think, but to act on the results of that deliberation. All this is general. How do you develop your own ethical perspective? Well, it's complex, but we might begin by thinking about what it is we're doing here. Ethical awareness should be articulated in a variety of circumstances if it is to be effective. And that's what we're doing here. We're looking at some of the tensions and the complexities derived by others everywhere from World War II Nazi medical experiments to the tensions of social scientists and documentary studies to try to get an idea of articulating various kinds of problems that arise in the work that we do. And that technical considerations are tied to human concerns. The way that you'll take a photograph, what you decide to transcribe from a structured interview or not transcribe, what you decide to delete or edit out of a piece of film. These technical concerns are tied to human concerns, and it is very foolish to think that ethical considerations stop once someone else, an IRB, approves research. Rather, ethical consideration should be with you, not as an enemy, but as a colleague and a friend every step of the research. To remain ethically alert, you must consider the power of bureaucratic considerations, not the least of which is the American Academy. If you're doing research with me, you probably, in a 3-credit undergraduate course, have 15 weeks to complete your research. That means you have to design something that's very precise, very well done, and very executable. If not, you'll find yourself trying to scaffold together situations based on time constraints that will not produce the best, most authentic, most reliable, and valid research. And that the ability to communicate effectively is central to the maintenance of an ethical position. Writing lucidly, speaking forcefully is critical. How do you think about a sort of a system for making your own decisions? Well, when presented with a complex problem, a set of problems, either ones that are given to you or ones that you're creating yourself, problems derived in your own research, you should think about summarizing what it is you are, the setting, the characters, the action, establish the facts, and determine the dilemma, or as we called them earlier, the tension. You should try to refer to any existing literature on the case that you're examining, if it's a case given to you by someone else to study, or a case derived, again, from the complexity of your own research, and see what others have said about the kind of complexities derived here. And if appropriate in some cases, think about legal analysis, what it is that the law tells us we can and cannot do, for example, about the autonomy of individuals. We might think about using an established system. We've talked about utilitarianism, Kantianism, and social justice theory. The Belmont Report and the professional codes, such as those found in the APA, are also important, as a systematic way to lead you through ethical decision making. You might, at this point, take a Kantian turn and determine what ought to be done in light of the literature review and the ethical analysis and ensure that the action is consistent and fair for a standard of action. Again, recall Kant, acting only according to those principles in which you can be certainly justified or sure that they could be a universal standard for action. And 5, always look at what can be learned, what might be seen as the instrumental value, the lessons that could be learned from the case. In terms of your own documentary project, what should you think about? Well, you should think about what you know and what you can do, what it is that your previous education has prepared you to study, and what it is that you feel prepared to study in a limited time frame. You should think about your responsibility to others, the rights, the dignity of those you're going to interview, those you're going to study, those you're going to document. What is your responsibility towards fair treatment for those people? In terms of your research design, you should have, and I said again, the idea of taking with you the idea of ethical responsibility throughout the study, in literature review, and ask yourselves these questions. Did you perform a complete and competent literature review? A search engine on the net coming up with a few keywords is not a complete literature review. Complete literature review involves looking at peer-reviewed articles, looking at articles that have been reviewed by other researchers. Did you develop a mental model of the phenomena you want to investigate, a construct? Did you look at predictor and outcome variables? Did you address the validity, the truthfulness of what you're going to find out, the reliability, that your findings could be confirmed by others? Have you developed a sampling plan for the documentary work that is reasonable? And have you tailored the study to meet your demands of time? As well, have you thought about which of these tools you're most proficient with and which of these tools you can operationalize in the limited amount of time you have? Writing, photography, tape recording, film, the World Wide Web. Each of these is wonderful kind of technology, but it's a complex technology. Each has own demands. And everyone who's worked in the field of qualitative research, fieldwork, documentary studies, no matter what you want to call it, has found that using these tools will have certain complexities. How can we make sure that we are using the tools to bring forth what we have found to be the truth? As we end this lecture, I want you to think about ways that philosophy can help us recall the tensions that we have in doing field work. I'll return again to Coles. Coles is listening to a student, a photographer, a college senior. Well, that's very much what you would probably be in taking this course. Say the following. The student says, "I'll be sitting there in someone's home. I've interrupted their life. The nerve of me. And I think to myself, what is wrong? Why don't I take a politely leave? Why am I being so conniving?" That's the word I should use, I'd ask. Why should that family let me hang around? I use that phrase as if it means I'll be a fly on the wall, and their already difficult life won't be made any worse. But it's not true. And I know it's not true, and they do too. I suppose I could try to bribe them, pay them, but that's not right, or is it? Why shouldn't they be paid? They're poor, they need the money, and I'll get something out of this, that's certain. We don't get into it, this subject, when we sit here in the classroom talking about someone's photograph or someone's book. We do our documentary work, we get recognition, we build our lives up by careers, and there's nothing in it for them. They put up with us. Sure, we're trying to help them in the broad sense, tell the world about their problems. But I'm not convinced that political change takes place because of the photographic work people do. Even the Farm Service Administration didn't do much for Roosevelt in his New Deal. Once he lost effective control of Congress in 1930, that was it, even though the FSA pictures were pouring out from those developing studios. I'm a history major. I just wrote a paper on the New Deal, and I wish the FSA did accomplish more. That way I'd feel better about what journalism can do for all those people we run around trying to catch for some story or other. The tensions of these students, the idea of invading the privacy, the autonomy of others, is something that you'll feel. You'll feel it both in the work of others that you study. Certainly James A.G.'s rage in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men is a result of these kinds of tensions, and you'll feel it in your own work. But in feeling these tensions and trying to figure out what to do in the time you have to do it to help further your own research goals, and then as well as to respect the autonomy, the privacy of others, think also about what we've looked at in this lecture, and that is the power of philosophy to provide a guide to those actions which will lead you to the good, the proper, and the virtuous. The proper and the virtuous.